Anthony, thank you for joining me. It's an honour to have you on. I first saw you on the Unslaved podcast a few years ago, Michael Tazarian and David Whitehead. I followed your work since then. I've got you on social media. I think it's incredibly refreshing to take what might be perceived as unscientific science to the scientific community and ruffle a few feathers. What turned you towards this work, the esoteric and the supernatural that you've been writing about for so long?
A genuine interest to just understand and know. And I know that sounds like a glib statement, but I've always been very intrigued by exactly what this reality really is. I'm always somebody that asks questions and then further questions, because effectively we are sentient beings having an experience, and we are perceiving an external reality around us that we just take for granted without ever thinking it's most peculiar and bizarre. As one philosopher once said, why is there something rather than nothing, when it would be much easier there to be nothing at all? And then we have the issue of why sentience has developed, why consciousness, why self-aware consciousness, why are we self-aware at all? We could be just as effective not being aware. Indeed, I read a few years ago that the most effective life form on the planet is the amoeba. Now, the amoeba is not sentient. It doesn't need to love or hate or have anticipations and hopes and fears, but we do. So clearly there is a mismatch between what reality seems to be and what it presents to ourselves. And I first became interested way back in 1966, December 1966, when I had a bout of double pneumonia and pleurisy when I was 12. And while I was in the crisis of pneumonia, I was at home because my mother was a nurse, so she was nursing me at home. And in the crisis of pneumonia, you have quite profound hallucinations. And the hallucinations were of such quality that even my 12-year-old brain was thinking, what on earth am I seeing here? These things seem to be in external space. They seem to be around me, and yet nobody else can see them, but they seem real. And when I recovered from that, I then developed, and I've had all my life, I have what's called classic migraine. And in classic migraine, I get the aura state. And in recent years, I don't get the headache, I just get the aura state. Yeah. And in the aura state, you have hallucinations. You see things, you feel strange. And also, all through my life, I've also experienced something that I guarantee a lot of the people that are listening to this conversation will have. Deja vu sensations, which have always intrigued me, but also something called hypnagogia and hypnopompia. And these are those states when you are in the liminal states between awake and asleep. You see things. You'll either see shapes, faces in profile, or you'll suddenly see a flash image of a place or a location, or you'll hear a voice. Now, I'll give an example of this because this was what really stimulated, because after I was at school and everything, and went to university in the early 1970s, working class kid, which was quite unusual in those days for people from my background to go to university, which meant I thought differently, and I was an 11+ failure. So I'd actually gone through the secondary modern school thing. In fact, I started in the C stream of a secondary modern school, which is quite extraordinary to think. In 1965, I was in the C stream of a secondary modern school. And in 1973, I was at one of Britain's top universities. I was at Warwick. So there was quite a massive change in my lifestyle and everything else. But again, that's an aside. But after I graduated, and I did a degree in sociology and history, and sociology gave me an interest in the sociology of belief, the sociology of language, the sociology of religion. But I went into management, and I had a career in various companies in management. But the deja vu sensations always intrigued me. But one day I was at work in the office, working for an airline. I was working at Stansted Airport. And I was sitting in front of my computer, and suddenly, and it's extraordinary now, anybody that has hypnagogic imagery will know this. It just suddenly happens. And I was looking down from a tree, looking down at an old man reading a newspaper. And it was like it appears in your periphery vision. It also appears in your periphery consciousness, because you don't necessarily even equate what you're seeing. And then I looked up, and then I could see a square. It was a square with traffic around the edges. And there was an ambulance running down one side with the alarms ringing, the siren ringing. And I knew it was somewhere in Latin America, and I'm pretty damn sure it was Buenos Aires. Right. Okay. Mm. And then by the time what happens with these things, you then switch your attention to it and it evaporates. And a few days later, I had a similar experience. And this time I was looking up through a glass table at an elderly woman drinking a cup of coffee, and she was placing the cup of coffee onto the glass table, and I was looking up through the glass table. Now, to me, that seemed to me that it was either remote viewing, or I was attuning into the consciousness field of a bird in the tree and probably a cat or a little dog. And these intrigued me. So I was in the position, 1999, I'd done a contract out in Eastern Europe, and I had sufficient money to be able to take a year out to write a book. I just had this burning need to write a book, but I didn't know what I'd write about. And my wife turned around to me, she said, well, you've got sufficient capital, let's just do it. Take the year out, get this out of your way and just write the book. And as they say, the rest is history, because I then, in that year, I wrote my first book, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. And that book has now sold, 80,000 copies worldwide, and has been translated into most major European languages. And it's just about to come out in Greek. It'll come out in Greek in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. And it continues to sell. You know, it's still my best-selling book. It's on Audible. It's out on Kindle. And because it was a proper publisher, I didn't need to vanity publish or anything else. It was a publisher that pays me and paid me in advance. So it worked really well. And their distribution is fantastic. They got the distribution all over the world. So it was quite good.
And what did you, in your work, what did you put to that experience? How have you sort of logically reasoned that?
How have I reasoned the things I was seeing, the hypnagogic imagery and everything? I've concluded over my period of, I'm now working on my 12th book. And over that period, each book is iterative on the previous one. And as I acquire more knowledge, what is happening is that as my books are written, more people get involved in my work, which means that more people can give me feedback about the things I need to. So in recent years, for instance, a lot more younger academics are interested in my work. People that are doing some very interesting research in DMT and altered states of consciousness and everything. So as it's developed, the model has changed. The model has developed. It's not really changed, but it's been more refined as I've gone along. And my latest work, I'm concluding, and it's not original, but I'm trying to do the science of this. So it's not just the statement. I do the background science of this, is that consciousness is a field. And I know, again, it's not original, but consciousness, we can attune in to different elements of perception. And I argue that it does seem from quantum physics that the idea of space is an illusion. Space is not there. And indeed, I've just written literally about 20 minutes ago a section on the Big Bang for my new book. And in that I argue, that space was created by the Big Bang. But at the point of the Big Bang, there was nothing. There was no space, there was no time, there was nothing. And suddenly something happened. Now, the Big Bang wasn't big and it wasn't a bang, okay? It was incredibly tiny. And suddenly from nowhere, as if it had been switched on, as if somewhere outside of whatever we are, somebody had switched on a simulation or switched on a computer game, because it just suddenly, and it suddenly expands out. But of course, the space itself was being created. So the Big Bang created space and time, and matter then was in that. Now, there is something known in quantum physics as entanglement. And in entanglement, it is that if you take two subatomic particles and you put it in the same quantum state, and then you place those subatomic particles a distance away from each other, if you do something to one particle, the other one reacts immediately, irrespective of distance. So this effectively means that these two particles could be the other side of the universe, but in some way they have an entangled relationship. And the information between one to the other is instantaneous. It's not restricted by Einstein's rule about the speed of light, 106,000 miles per second. It's not that. It's instantaneous. And a guy called Professor David Bohm many years ago suggested that really what we're looking at is, in fact, the same particle and looking at it from a different angle. And he gave a wonderful analogy of this. He said, imagine that there's a group of aliens billions of miles away, and somehow we're in communication with them. but we can only send them messages. And what they decide to do, for some bizarre reason, the people on Earth decide what we'll do is we'll take an aquarium, a square aquarium or rectangular aquarium with one fish in it. And what they suggest we decided to do is to put one camera at one side of the aquarium and another camera at the front of the aquarium. So there's one here and one there. Okay, so there are different angles to each other. And we would then send the signal to the aliens, both signals. So the aliens get the two signals, and the aliens are getting two separate signals, and they think they're looking at two objects. The fish is moving in the tank, and they're seeing it from different angles. So the movement of the fish is different. Yeah. But what one of the clever aliens, call him David Bohm, looked at this and thought, no, hang on, there's a sequence here. If that object moves that way, the other one instantaneously knows that the other one has moved in that direction and moves in a different direction. Then they start to look at it more logically, and they realize that they're actually looking at the same object. And at a deeper level of reality, David Bohm argued that's what everything is. It's enfolded. It's enfolded within itself. Yeah. Now, imagine at the first moment of the Big Bang, everything that exists in this universe that has developed over the last 13.9 billion years started from that one point. That would mean that all of the particles that exist in the universe, including the molecules that make up our body, were all in one place at the same time, in one single quantum state, which effectively means that after the Big Bang, we were all entangled. Everything is entangled. So therefore, non-locality is something that all subatomic particles, and therefore the subatomic particles that make up your brain and everything else, are all entangled. Now, this means the great mystery of space, because space is literally nothing. And as philosophers have said for hundreds of years, if you had just two objects in space, two planets, and then one planet disappears, where does the space go? Does the space exist if there are not objects in it? Now, by definition, space is nothing. So if there are no objects in space, it should not exist. So therefore, even distance disappears if there are no relative objects. And of course, this is what Einstein argues in relativity. So I would argue that we can, under certain circumstances, whatever those circumstances are, neurologically or whatever, we can attune into other places, other locations. Now, again, time is the same. There was a wonderful book written called The End of Time, which was written by a guy called Julian Barber about 20 years ago. And Barber argues that time is the same. Time isn't what we think it is. And indeed, many years ago, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time about this. But time is not what we think it is at all. As Einstein said, it's an illusion, but it's a particularly powerful one. So this is what I think is happening. In general terms, we are programmed to work and live and exist within this simulation. So therefore, our whole worldview and our brain acts as an attenuator to allow us to exist within this scenario. But there are other scenarios. And we find it very difficult to think outside of the constraints of our cave. It's like Plato's cave, there's shadows on the cave.
So I'm very wary all the time of using the word simulation, just because it automatically to me puts in computer model.
Yes.
If you look at the Hindu yuga cycles and the Manvantaras, I think they're called, you might find that they sort of have the breath and they breathe the breath electricity into life, and that electrifies everything. Would that be, with the Big Bang, in relation to the Big Bang, could that be their version of that, their initial Big Bang, which is the mind of what they would call Brahma or God, breathing into existence reality?
Yeah, absolutely. They have a concept called Kali Chakra or Kali Chakra. And this is the idea of expansion and coming back and going out and coming back. Something, again, I write about extensively, the concept of the eternal return, the eternal recurrence, that everything is cycles or spirals. Yeah. Now, your point is a very good one, because to use the term simulation implies it's a simulation of something else. Baudelaire, the French philosopher, wrote many times about simulacra and simulation. this is not a simulation. It's not a simulation of something else. It's far more interesting than that.
Right.
It seems to be created out of digital information, and our brains are attuned to take in this digital information in some way. And again, this is based upon hard science. I'm not just plucking these ideas out of the air. These are ideas that have been actively thought about at the moment. There's a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in Canada, one of the world's leading research places, and they're looking for the pixelation of space. You know, it's the Perimeter Institute, they're working on this. And it was because around about 12 years ago, there was a very peculiar signal that was picked up by the GEO 6000 gravity wave sensitive device in southern Germany, where the waves they picked up didn't make any sense. And they started to understand that this was something to do with the holographic nature of reality. And Hogan and his team are working on this. Now, they've also concluded they think they know even how the mechanism may work. And it's to do with black holes, surprisingly enough. It's to do with the second law of thermodynamics. It's to do with the idea that information can never be lost from an enclosed system, that entropy continues and everything else as well. And it's to do with the simple idea that information, it has recently been discovered that information is physical. Okay. You know, we talk about information all the time, but from the work of a guy called Claude Shannon in the 1950s, it was discovered that information is physical. And the guy that's really doing the research on this is a guy called Vlatko Vedrell, who is a professor of quantum physics at the University of Singapore. And Vedrell wrote a book a few years ago putting these ideas forward. And the idea that information is physical. So therefore, if I take a cell phone and I throw it into a black hole, technically, information has been lost to the universe because it's destroyed. It doesn't turn into anything else because we know that energy never gets lost. It's the law of conservation, it just gets changed into something else. Yeah. But here we have a scenario where energy gets lost. Now, a few years ago, Stephen Hawking came up with the idea of Hawking radiation, which is the idea that black holes actually give off energy as well. They don't just suck everything in, they give information off. And that information is smeared along the event horizon of the black hole. And if there is a bank of black holes surrounding the edge of the universe, imagine the argument, you know, the Big Bang, as I was talking about before, starts and it expands outwards like an expanding balloon. And the edge of the universe is like the inside of an expanding balloon. Now that balloon is around, I think I saw that something like 54 billion miles, 54 billion light years, I think, something like that. Anyway, is the actual circumference, the circumference of this big expanding something. Dotted on the edge of that are tiny black holes. And there are literally countless numbers of these. And each one of these black holes are Planck squares. So the Planck length is the smallest possible amount of space you can have. And it's a square of the black hole. And each one of those contains 1 byte of information. Okay? Digital information on or off.
Yeah.
They've done the calculation. How they've done this calculation, I don't know, but it is intriguing. If you calculate the amount of Planck length squares that would be on the edge of this huge thing that surrounds us, it's exactly the same amount of digital information that would be needed to recreate the universe. And they find this too big a coincidence. Now, it seems that this is suggestive of the fact that we are living in a 2-dimensional hologram that we perceive as being 3-dimensional. And this is where I argue where David Bohm comes along, because a guy called Carl Pribram many years ago said the brain works on holographic principles. So what we have is a hologram processing a hologram. Right. So this is where the simulation argument comes from. Plus there are other arguments. I mean, a guy called Bostrom came up with a wonderful scenario of how we could be in a simulation, in raised commas, whatever we want to call it, and how that could be, and how it could be our own future people, our own humanity in the future, creating an ancestor sim that we're existing within, which is very intriguing.
Yeah. I thought about that. You know, when you're just a kid and you don't really know what you're doing. I've actually had that thought as a kid, that we're actually being created by our future selves and we've been just put back here. You mentioned about energy changing in that talk there. let's move into death. You wrote, was it your first book about life after death?
I did, yeah.
Do you believe that this just ends? Because I know you're at the Daemon, which I did read a while ago now. Yeah, probably best for you to take it from there.
Okay. The first thing that I always say about this is the book title was wrong, and frustratingly wrong. And indeed, I was talking recently to a professor of psychology at one of the Canadian universities, and this was the thing he was saying to me. He said, so many academics would not have read your first book purely and simply because of the title.
Yeah.
And it was placed within the New Age sections of bookshops. And what happened then was it meant that the New Agers were reading it and thought, was expecting a book on life after death and talking about mediums and communication with spirits. And that wasn't what I was about. But the people that should have been reading it, the academics, were not reading it because they don't go near anywhere like that. So it was quite frustrating for me. It should have been called Cheating the Ferryman. And the new book will be called Cheating the Ferryman, which will be a recapitulation of what I've discovered in the 15, 16 years since the first book came out. But in the book, I suggest that I don't know whether there's life after death. I have no idea. I have no overarching proof that there is life after death. There's evidence to suggest that maybe there is something. I wrote a book with Irvin Laszlo a few years ago where we did discuss the idea that there could be life after death. But I remain strongly non-convinced by it, to be honest. I've never seen anything that's really proven it to me beyond all shadow of a doubt. And I include in this things like reincarnation and past life memories and everything else. I could argue that past life memories are just memories of the collective us, and it's just memories of the collective unconscious, but we can come back onto that. But I wanted to come up with an idea. Well, I didn't want to come up with anything. The first book was just me wanting to explain Deja Vu. That's where I started. I didn't expect to come up with an overarching hypothesis about what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. All I wanted to know what Deja Vu was, from my own experiences. But by the time I'd finished writing the book, I'd come up with a hypothesis that never leaves from science, in that there is nothing I say in that book that is either actual science or hypothetical science or theoretical physics or theoretical science. Okay. And the reason I'm different to other writers, and this is a subtlety that people miss in my books, I don't talk about life after death. I talk about what happens at death. It's an important point. It's at the point of death. Now, the reason I talk about at the point of death is that time perception is personal. There are two forms of time. There's clock time, which is the linear movement of a clock face. Then there is internal time. Now, as I've said many times in interviews, time is peculiar. Time is the only thing that's measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples. You can only ever have a minute of a minute. And I can never know in any objective way whether your minute is the same as my minute. Because we could sit there and say, right, a minute has just passed now. But you could have been, it could have been my version of hours for you. Okay. And again, in the book, I give evidence of this because people know this experience. There'll be people out there who've had these experiences. You get given bad news, time goes, or you fall off a horse, or you're in a car crash. Suddenly time becomes elastic. I've had people write to me who've been in car crashes and they were watching the paint coming down in slow motion all around them and watching the car buckle in front of them. How can that be? If time is just a constant, that's impossible. And I argue it's because what happens in the brain in times of stress is what actually happens to the brain at the time of death. So what's happening is you think you are dying. When you're in a car crash, you think you are dying. So the chemicals that would ordinarily be released as you die are released because your brain thinks you're dying. So it's a little death. It's a petty, it's a little death. Now, if we then extrapolate from that, so why does this happen? Why at the point of death does time expand? And I believe the reason it expands is for one very good reason. There's something called the Moody traits, which is about near-death experiences, and there's about 10 or so traits. It's also the Grayson scale as well, Bruce Grayson, who wrote the foreword for the first book, by the way. So the guy who the Grayson scale is based upon is Professor Bruce Grayson. And Grayson and Moody both suggested there are about 10 different factors that medical people can use to describe what a near-death experience is. So when somebody says, oh, I was dying and I was floating above my body and all these strange things happened, they can tick them off and say, yeah, this sounds like a near-death experience. Now, the one that is the most intriguing of all of them is something called a panoramic life review, which most people will recognize as being my life flash before my eyes. You know, this has been recorded since the beginning of time. People have said that, you know, suddenly I'm drowning and suddenly everything I see, my whole life, just flashes in front of me. That is in a near-death experience. I argue that in a real death experience, it doesn't flash in front of you because your time perception has already expanded to accommodate. So it could be that the final few seconds of your life could be 70 years relative to you. Relative to somebody watching you, you die. And this is a very important point. If the final second of your life is 70 years, you are 70 years in that dying state. But somebody watching you, it's just a second, and they move on in time. And you're already always stuck in that point, or for 70 years. And in that 70 years, your panoramic life review is a literal minute-by-minute recreation of your life, okay? So you live your life again. But this time, there's a massive difference from your first life. In the first life, you're a singular being. I call this the Eidolon. In your virgin life, you're an Eidolon. In the second life, there is part of you that remembers that you lived this life before and remembers in detail what happened. And that's your daemon. And your daemon is that nagging voice you have in your head that says, don't do this. Or it recognizes somebody and says, and your heart suddenly goes, poof, and it's, do you know that person's going to be special to you? We all have these experiences. Nobody explains them except for myself. So you suddenly recognize somebody, or you have a deja vu sensation. You go to a big old house and you're walking around, and then suddenly it's, I've done this before. I've been here before. And it's recognitions, it's leakages from the demonic consciousness to the eidolonic consciousness. Now, imagine a scenario that you're driving a car, and I've had people write to me about this. I'll give an example of how this is. There was a guy that wrote to me after the first book came out, and he had been a soldier for the Rhodesian army in 1969. And he was driving back on a mission from Mount Darwin in the north of Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe as it is now. He was riding on the top of an armored car, and he had a submachine gun in front of him, and his job was to watch out for trouble. As they came round a bend, a voice in his head screamed at him and said, duck, duck, ambush, 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 you must duck. And he was so shocked by this, he didn't move. And then suddenly something pushed him out of the seat into the netting, into the camouflage netting at the side. He broke his finger as he fell, as a machine gun ripped into the seat. As he said to me, he would have been hit in the throat, the stomach, and the genitals. He would have been killed instantly, okay? That voice saved him. Now, imagine a scenario that in the previous life, he died that day. All the rest of his life then, he didn't exist last time. So it's a completely new life. And the daemon had caused a bifurcation of his life at that point and saved him. Now, this leads me to believe that what we're actually existing in is like a third-person computer game version of our lives. That we are in a game, of want of a better term, that every outcome of every decision we can make is already encoded in the game. Therefore, the daemon can change things. The daemon can guide you if it wishes, or it can allow you to carry forward. Now, this would explain one fascinating fact about deja vu, or deja vecu, already lived, which I think is a more accurate term. As you get older, it drops off. The number of people who get deja vu sensations, the direct correlation between age and number of experiences. This is because there will be a point in your life that you got to last time, and then the rest of your life, you won't have deja vus because you didn't experience it again.
Yeah.
And the only time that deja vu then starts again is when somebody gets towards the end of their life. Now, I'll give one final example from my own life that proves this theory. And this is uncanny. I don't know if you've ever heard me tell this story, but this is extraordinary, okay? Back in 1988, I went to a music shop and I bought a CD. Going with the CD was for 50p, I could buy a sampler CD that had a series of tracks on it describing new albums that were about to come out. Bought that on a Saturday afternoon, went home on the Saturday evening, played the original CD, and while my wife was cooking, typical man, my ex-wife was cooking in the kitchen and everything else, I put on the other CD. First track comes on, second track comes on, then the third track came up, and I had the most alarming deja vu sensation I've ever had in my life. I knew that song. But not only that, I knew immediately it was my death song. So I called my then wife in, Jenny, and I said, Jen, can you listen to this song? And she said, why? And I said, because I want it played at my funeral. And she went, what? And I said, yes. And I want my will changed to reflect the fact that I want this to be played at my funeral. And the next Saturday, with Jenny thinking what the hell is going on in his mind, I had my will changed. So that's the record. Now, it's a very happy record, and it's called Round of Blues by Sean Colvin. It's off an album called Fat City, okay? So roll forward many, many years, we're now talking about probably 2004, something like that. I was divisional human resources manager for a group of hospitals, private hospitals in the north of England. And my job was razzing around the country solving problems in various hospitals. It was a great job, and I had this beautiful RX-8 Wankel rotary engine sports car, which cost me a fortune in terms of tax, but there's another story. And I was razzing around the country solving problems. One winter's evening, I'm going down the M62 towards Milne Row, if you know the M62. Okay. Now, one of the things, we were talking football before, the other great love of my life is music. Now, in those days, I'm always a person that loves my technology, and I had what was called an Arcos MP3 player. And on this Arcos, I had around about 16,000 different MP3s, or my whole music collection was on there. And I always had it on random play, always on random play. So there was a 1 in 16,000 chance of any track coming up. I'm coming down towards Milne Row, coming down the hill, going down towards Milne Row. I'm playing, it's rainy, it's horrible, it's dark. And as I'm driving down, Round of Blues comes on. The first time that song had ever played in the whole time I was playing random play. I was back in my mind to living in Colchester, listening to that record. And I thought, what do I associate this record with? It's my death song. And then a shiver of fear absolutely went up my spine. I feel it now. And suddenly my left hand grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it into the slow lane. As it did so, the car there was a truck in front of it, and it had crash barriers on it. The crash barriers fell off the back of the truck and bounced in the road. They'd have bounced on my car. I was killed that moment. The reason my earlier self associated that with my death was that it was the last thing I heard in my last life. That was absolute proof. And that was before I'd actually even started researching the book. But to me, that was almost my daemon giving me evidence that my hypothesis has validity. And it has for me anyway.
That's an incredible story. And I think people will actually, when they hear stories like that, they'll start putting two and two together in their own lives, because I don't think the average person would actually think that would. I had one yesterday. I had my head in the fridge. That's fairly common. And I thought, I've been here before. It was like, there was the way the fridge was. And there was some music playing in the background, and it was that song, and I thought, yeah, this is definitely a deja vu experience. I got no idea what it was, but most people wouldn't have even considered or put two and two together like that. You know, how does the scientific community take theories like that?
Well, the interesting thing is with deja vu, for instance, if you read any book on psychology, I'll make a point here. There are 72 different theories on deja vu. 72.
Right.
There was a book recently written, well, comparatively recently written by, I can't think of his name now. He's a professor of psychology in one of the universities in the southern states of America. It'll come to me in a second. And my theory is one of the 72, by the way, which I was delighted about. Nice. You know, he actually considered me to be one of the theories. But the one that you will discover in most academic books and books on psychology is something called the Efron visual pathways hypothesis. And it was put forward by a guy called Richard Efron in 1962. Okay, and it's quite a reasoned idea. And the idea is both of our eyes have an optic nerve running from the back, which runs to the back of the brain, to the visual cortex at the back. Mm-hmm. Now, in order for each eye to have stereo vision, the visual field is split on each of the eyes. The visual field is split into two signals, which is the left field and the right field. And you can imagine, rather like a pair of binoculars, this means you have stereo vision. Okay. What Efron argued was that one of the signals, the one that goes to the non-dominant hemisphere, gets processed subconsciously by the non-dominant hemisphere. The signal then crosses the corpus callosum, which is the communication body between the right and left hemisphere, and comes into the dominant, usually left hemisphere of the brain. That is at the same moment that the other signal, which has been slightly delayed from the eyes, which is showing the same image, comes in. So you get this kind of double vision where you get this feeling of you've seen this before, and the brain becomes confused because the non-dominant hemisphere tends to be non-verbal and things, and we tend to exist in our dominant hemisphere. So there's this kind of confusion. And this is the visual pathways. And it makes sense. It has neurological validity and everything else. The only problem is that this is for 0.5 of a second is the delay. Now, I defy anybody out there when they've had a deja vu sensation to say it lasts 0.5 of a second. It doesn't. It lasts far longer than that. You have the feeling that you have time to recognize the fact that you are recognizing, literally the word recognize, the scene. Also, it is not just sight. It's related to smells. It's related, as you said, to the sounds you were hearing. Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, the sounds cannot be part of the visual pathways hypothesis. It doesn't work. Sound and smell are processed in different parts of the brain in different ways. And this was proven by a guy called Akira O'Connor, who works with a researcher called Chris Moulon. And Chris Moulon's one of the world's leading experts in deja vu research at the University of Leeds. And Akira O'Connor had discovered that people who were born blind have something called déjà senti, I think it is, already heard, whereby they will hear something and then hear it again. Right. As soon as this was discovered, it meant that the Efron hypothesis was out of the window. So we're now back really to no real neurological explanation for deja vu. And I get very irritated when people contact me and they say your theory on deja vu is nonsense.
Yeah.
And they cite the Efron hypothesis, and they don't realize I know I'm streets ahead of them on this. I don't just make these statements. No. I just don't. It's based upon facts. So all the other hypotheses are all hypothetical. And I believe mine is the only one that actually can explain. Now, again, so just before I finish off here, there is another research associate of mine who, funnily enough, is a quantum physicist by training, Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who now he's American, but he lives in Switzerland. And again, if anybody's interested here, just go onto YouTube, If you put in Anthony Peake, Arthur Funkhauser, you'll get me interviewing him in Switzerland. Okay, so you're interested in his work. But Art wrote a fascinating paper a few years ago called The Dream Theory of Deja Vu. And this is intriguing. He argues that the reason that we have difficulty in quantifying when we have a deja vu, because the official definition of deja vu was put forward by a guy called Vernon Neppe, somebody else who's aware of my work and has written about me. And he lives in Seattle. He works in a hospital in Seattle. He's now Professor Vernon Neppe. He's a psychiatrist. And Neppe's definition is, and I never quite fully remember, but it is basically a deja vu sensation is a memory from an undefined period in your past. And it has to be undefined. So when people turn around and say, oh, it's deja vu all over again, that's not deja vu, because if you're thinking that you remember last time the experience, that is by definition not deja vu. Deja vu is, I don't remember when. Okay.
Right.
So what Funkhauser argues is that when we have a deja vu, we have had a precognitive dream a few days before, a few weeks before, or whatever. And we know with dreams, we kind of remember them, and then we wake up and then we think, oh, I'm going to remember that dream. And then it evaporates like a snowball under the sun. But there is a part of us that subliminally still remembers that dream. Okay. And then the precognitive dream comes true, and we find ourselves in the circumstances of the precognitive dream. So we have this kind of vague recollection, but we don't know when it was. Now, this suggests that we precognitively dream regularly. And again, there was somebody called J.W. Dunn, who in 1927 wrote a book called An Experiment with Time, who suggests a model whereby we all precognitively dream. And after this book came out, people were, and I suggest you do this, guys, because it's very interesting. Just have a notebook by your bedside. And when you wake up, write down your dreams and find out how many of them actually come to pass in reality, because I'll guarantee there's a lot of them that do. They may not be literally, because remember, dreams warp things. So it might be a symbol. It might be something out of location, but you will then come across it later. Okay.
That's very Jungian, isn't it?
Totally. Totally. The whole Jungian, funnily enough, Art Funkhauser now is, in fact, and he's an expert on lasers, but he is a Jungian analyst. And of course, going back to Jung, my point earlier on is the Jungian collective unconscious. Yeah. And of course, what I'm saying is that there's this informational field that sits below, which is effectively the memory of all of us. Because in my later work, I argue and suggest that you and I are not singular beings. We are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, as Bill Hicks said. We are at a higher level, what I call the Uber Daemon level. We are just one consciousness. And that then is brought down into individuated sources of consciousness that some suffer from what's called amnesis, is what Plato argued. That you forget who you are, you forget what you are, because we're inside the simulation. So we can't really know who we are, because if we did, we wouldn't function in the simulation effectively. So we have to forget. But some of us suffer from anamnesis, which is the loss of amnesis. And I think this is what a lot of mystical traditions, this is what esoteric traditions have been trying for years. Two things: losing anamnesis and getting in contact with your daemon. Both of these is what magical traditions do and have been doing since the year dot. What is it they say? Find the inner you, find the inner Buddha, find your spirit inside yourself. And they say all the time, don't they? You don't go out to find truths, you go in. Yeah. And this is where I think you seek out the daemon. And this is what esoteric training is all about.
And so that fits perfectly into like the non-dualistic philosophy of the East, where everything is one thing. And I suppose the term waking up, which is very popular now, most people haven't an idea what that means, I don't think, but the term waking up, would you put that to waking up to the self, which you might consider the daemon?
Yes, it's demonic awareness. It's suddenly becoming attuned to your own higher self, as people would call it, or your guardian angel, your genius. The various traditions have, you know, every single tradition in the world has this concept of human mental duality. You know, it's from the ancient Greeks is the daemon and the eidolon, and the Gnostics, but you carry it through. They all have this tradition. even some like the Tembe and the Biongbi, who is probably the nearest to my hypothesis, which are people in Nigeria, have this particular model. So it's a universal. It's something we instinctively resonate with. Once people hear about my hypothesis, I see people nodding, and they're going, yeah, I see that.
Deep.
And it resonates. And the thing is, because my model is now so extensive, I believe that I know it sounds vain, but I have an answer for most things, because I've been spending years thinking it through. My model works on so many different levels. And that's why at the moment I'm being approached by young researchers into virtual reality. And they're saying, I've just read your book. Have you known about the implications of virtual reality for what you're talking about? I've got other people contacting me who are psychologists. I've got people, physicists to contact me, neurologists. Everybody is suddenly going, what is this guy talking about? This is sensational stuff. How is it not better known? And it's not better known because people are still preoccupied with this new age wacko nonsense of crystals. And, you know, you don't need all that. It is, and channeling. Believe me, this is far more exciting, and it's based on science. This is why you will not hear me on television and things, because they don't want people like me on television.
No.
They want people that they can mock, that they can have a go at. The amount of times I've been invited to be speak at skeptical conferences where they're inviting me to speak so they can knock me down. Every time they back out. 3 occasions I've had invites to do that. And on 3 occasions at the last minute, they back down. And I know why they back down. It's suddenly, oh dear, this guy seems to know his quantum physics. He seems to know his neurology. He seems to know his neurochemistry. Do we really want to end up in a debate with him? So they run away.
Just to clarify, to wrap maybe this little bit up, what would be the purpose of the daemon in that situation then? So what is the end goal? So for example, in your story there, where you said it's essentially stopped you having that same event again, so you could live a longer life perhaps. What is the end goal? Would it be the realization of self? Is that the end goal?
Yeah. Well, let's look at it in 2 ways. Imagine your life is a third-person computer game, and you're the on-screen sprite. Your daemon is the game player. So remember, from my generation, not my generation, but you know, I'm a grown kid now. I used to play I still play computer games with my virtual reality headset and everything. But there was a game that I really got into when I was in my 40s, which was Tomb Raider. So, you know, in Tomb Raider, first time you switch Tomb Raider on, you switch it on, and there's a little Lara Croft sprite in front of you. Now, that Lara sprite has no memory of any other games it's played because it's just fresh, and that's an Eidolon. So what happens is Lara starts to run down the corridor, but you're moving her. Now, this is the difference. The daemon can't move you except under exceptional circumstances, but let's continue with the analogy. She's running down the corridor. She goes into a room, and there's a big monster, and it kills her. She's dead. She's dead. That daemon is gone forever. By this stage, the game player, the daemon, suddenly goes, ooh, I'm 2 people. And it goes, right, I can play that game now again, but this time I know there's a monster in that room. So I'll make sure that my little Eidolon in the game doesn't go into that room. So it gets a bit further, and then it gets a bit further. And I believe what happens in real life is that we are here to explore as many avenues of ourselves as we possibly can, to explore every pain, every hope, every dream, every anticipation, to travel where we want, to meet the people we want. And in this point, I make the analogy of the movie Groundhog Day. Yeah. In Groundhog Day, Connors, the main character, remember, in the first day, that's his virgin life. The very first Groundhog Day he lives, he doesn't remember anything. He hasn't lived it before. He doesn't know it. He then wakes up, Sonny and Cher's on the radio, I got you, babe. He gets up and he realizes, and he thinks, this is weird. That's your second life. But what has happened with him is he's become a daemon. His daemon and his Eidolon are together. Okay. So he has the second day and he thinks he recognizes things. He's having a continual deja vu. Do you remember? He turns round to the lady in the bed and breakfast and he says, Mrs. So-and-so, do you ever have deja vu? And she said, I don't know. I'll have a look in the kitchen and see if the chef can find one for you, which I thought was really great. Interesting line here is I interviewed the guy who wrote that.
Nice.
And he was so intrigued by my theories, he's read the book and he's given it to all his mates. So, you know, it's a guy called, oh God, his name's escaped me, but anyway. So you live the life again. Now, in esoteric traditions and in Eastern traditions, there's this concept of achieving nirvana, the concept of oneness, like the word atonement means at oneness with your higher self, to live a perfect life in order to move on, in order to become an avatar, as you like. And this is what we're doing in this life. We live this life over and over again, and we follow all the avenues and all the hopes and dreams and everything else until in the end, we become, our consciousness is raised because we've experienced so much, or we subliminally decide, I've had enough of this game now. I want to move on. And then you die. Because remember, all of the things I've been talking about all happen in the final seconds of your life. So when you live the first past life review, which happens in a split second, at the end of that life, there's another one and another one and another one. It's Zeno's bisection paradox, or more accurately, Thomson's lamp. And you live in smaller bits of time until eventually you run out of time and you become perfect. And then you become an avatar. Now, this is when things, it's complete supposition on my part here now. This is going into theology. This is not based on anything I know. But I'd like to believe that this is the background to an awful lot of religious teachings. That you find your inner self guides you, and then you and your inner self come together. You are an eidolon and a daemon, but you come together as a singular being. And in doing so, you then move on to whatever you want to move on, to the life after death. Now, some people, I believe, I'd love to believe this, can go back into the life and help others. And they are literally bodhisattvas, as they talk about. And the bodhisattva goes back, because effectively, none of this is in contravention of, say, Buddhism or reincarnation, for one simple fact. This is the Bardo state. What I'm describing here is the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bardo state.
Yeah, I've got that there, yeah. That's an incredible theory, and it actually fits in like a glove, to be honest. You know, the Eleusinian Mysteries.
Yes, I do. In fact, yeah. Do you want me to talk about that now or not?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Because I'm delighted you mentioned that, because my new book in Greek that comes out in a few weeks' time, if we get off of this COVID thing, myself and a group of individuals will be recreating the Eleusinian Mysteries.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Not only are we recreating the ideas of the Eleusinian Mysteries, but we're going to be doing it in something called the Cave of Vari. The Cave of Vari, historians believe, is the cave that Plato placed his cave analogy, the lights on the shadows on the wall. Okay. And our plan is to recreate that in the original location. Now, Plato, it is believed, was a member of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, Eleusis was a place about 9 miles to the west of Athens. And in ancient Greek times, people would be initiated into the mysteries by walking from the center of Athens to Eleusis. And when they were in Eleusis, they then would go through a series of tests, a series of encounters with the underworld. It is all to do with Demeter and the myth of Persephone, and the idea of Persephone being taken to the underworld by Hades, and then she's under the underworld for 5 months, and then she's brought in, and it's the summer when Demeter finds her. Now, you'll love this because of where you're located. Last April, now I've been working very closely, as I said, with a group of really important researchers, and some of the researchers are a couple of guys, 2 Austrians, a consultant neurologist called Dr. Dirk Prokol, and a consultant psychologist called Engelbert Winkler. These 2 guys have invented something called the lucid light device, the hypnagogic light device. And again, if anybody's interested, if you go onto my YouTube channel, you will see me testing this device out. When it first came out, I was one of the first people to test this. This device can bring about altered states of consciousness. It can bring about out of the body experiences. It is extraordinary, okay? And it's been designed from the ground up by a neurologist. So we're not somebody just playing around with silly lights. This is serious stuff, okay? Now, last April, what happened was the two Austrians met a researcher, a postdoctoral psychologist, who mentioned that he had been working with traumatized soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, British soldiers from various places. And one of the places he was using and had been involved in was the Drakelow tunnels in Drakelow outside Kidderminster. Now, the Drakelow tunnels are a fascinating location. They were a shadow factory in the Second World War. They were originally built by rover cars. Originally, there'd been mine works in Drakelow, but the government realized they could build a secret place for building Spitfire wings. So what they did was they employed rover cars under hyper secrecy to build and drill into the hillside 5 miles of caves. And these caves are probably 12 foot wide by about 15 foot high. And they just run into darkness, and they're like a gridiron pattern like New York. You can get lost in there, okay? What happened was, I think 6,000 people worked down there during the war. There was a theatre. There was an operating theatre. There was a hospital. Vera Lynn sang down there, okay? When the Second World War ended, it was still hyper secret, and they turned it into a nuclear bomb shelter. And this was the bomb shelter that Princess Anne and her family would have been evacuated to do if there'd been nuclear war, okay? Then there's still listening stations. They've still got in there the listening stations where they were listening into the Russians, okay? Now, it was then declassified about 8 or 9 years ago, and it was bought by a local farmer, or the guy that local. Now, Drakelow is a really strange place. Drakelow, I did some research on Drakelow. It means Dragon's Hill in Anglo-Saxon. Drake is Anglo-Saxon for dragon, and low is hill. But the drake in Anglo-Saxon is not like a dragon from the Game of Thrones. This is more of a mystery, ghost-like entity that protects the land, okay? So there was something strange about Drakelow, and it was all focused around Drakelow Hill, where the caves are. Now, I then checked up, and I found that in the 12th century, there was a case of the first time in history of zombies in Drakelow. A group of people supposedly dug themselves out of the graves in the village and walked through the village centre. Okay, so Drakelow clearly has a strange vibe to it. So we decided that we would recreate Plato's cave inside Drakelow's tunnels. So we decided we'd bring along the Austrians, they'd bring along their lucid light device. Then there are a couple of other researcher friends of mine who have something called a ninth wave, which they still won't tell me exactly what it does, but it's virtual reality headsets that put you into an altered state of consciousness. Plus we had ambient music. So we had a group of people who came with us for the event. And before the event, they were placed into altered states of consciousness with the hypnagogic device and the ninth wave effect. We had Dr. David Luke from Greenwich University, one of the world's leading authorities on altered states of consciousness, who came along and they were testing whether precognition would take place with people. But, and this is where it gets weird, I was invited up to the caves to test them out by the psychologist and the guy who was the English agent for the lucid light device. And we went along to this place and we're walking through the corridors, and it is so creepy. Now, what is strange is the hillside, magic mushrooms grow. Okay, so we already have a link here to hallucinogenic substances. And I think this links around the whole thing and the atmosphere of the place. We're walking through the tunnels and everything. And the researcher turns around and he says, you know, this was one of the places that so many extraordinary psychic events have taken place. And he said, I've witnessed them. And he took me to this junction of two of the tunnels. And he said, right, I was standing here one day with a group of fellow researchers, and I had a can of Pepsi, empty can of Pepsi in my hand. And suddenly was poltergeist activity around us. There were movements and sounds. And he said, he turned around and something in him said, okay, if you are out there, I'm going to throw this Pepsi can into the darkness down this corridor here. If you can, throw it back. And he threw it into the darkness. And he said to me, it bounced there, and then it bounced over here in the other corridor. It had teleported from one location to another. Now, this guy is a postdoctoral researcher in psychology. He is not some ghost hunter. He's a serious researcher. And then he got out from his phone. He said, now, see where we're standing now. And he went onto his phone, and there was a video on his phone. He said, now look down that corridor there. Do you see that doorway? He said, look at that. And it was a film of the doorway I was looking at. And you cannot believe this. There is the shape of a human body, a head and shoulders and arms standing in the doorway. That's odd. But what is odder is the inside of the creature's body is stars.
Oh, wow.
It's like a star being. And I said to the guy, I said, can I use this? And he said, no, because the research group that took this are planning to use this and they want to keep it. You can talk about it, but you can't ever share it. I've got it on my phone. I videoed him of the video. I've got it. But, you know, and it's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. So there's something really weird down there. So what we did was we had these volunteers and we took them through that. And then myself and I was the master of ceremonies. And what I did was I did a lot of research on the Eleusinian Mysteries. So I named the locations as the names of the places that the Eleusinian Mysteries would have been, the place where the people would have originally gone, how they would have washed themselves and everything else as well. Then they'd move on. And the master of ceremonies would turn up, which was me dressed in purple robes. And I spoke to them initially in Greek. And the idea was I then take them into the darkness. And this is what was really clever. I explain the myth of Persephone and Demeter and the way in which Persephone, a young, beautiful girl, was wandering around in the dark, in the fields. And suddenly Hades sees her, falls in love with her, abducts her, takes her into the underworld. Demeter, her mother, is distraught, can't find her. Okay. So we're walking down and I'm telling this story. And as I'm telling this story, there was and these corridors are black, they're pitch black. All you have are the torches. And suddenly out of the darkness along one corridor, my friend Samantha Lee Treasure comes out. And she's also wearing a purple robe. And she's in the role of Persephone. And she explains how she'd been abducted and everything else. So by now, the people involved are really freaked out. They're really feeling quite strange. And the atmosphere down there is so peculiar. Then we take them to the darkest part of the cave. And we recreated Plato's cave. And I had them sit down. And then my associates had cardboard cutouts of animal shapes. And we had a torch behind them. And the idea was we would show the cardboard cutouts, which would reflect onto the back of the wall. And then they explain the myth of Plato's cave. Do you want me to explain roughly what that was? Okay. Plato asked us to imagine a group of people who had, for the whole of their lives, from the moment of their birth, been chained, tied down, looking at the back wall of a cave in darkness. And they couldn't move their heads. They could only look forward. Behind them is a walkway, a raised walkway, like a bridge. So it's behind them. And behind the bridge is a raised area with a fire. And the fire is there. And when people walked across the walkway behind the prisoners, they carried cardboard cutouts of animal shapes. So you'd see an ox or an ass or a donkey or a human figure or an eagle. And the people looking forward in the cave, the prisoners, would see shadows on the back of the cave. And because that's all they ever knew, that's what they believed reality was. It's the shadows on the back of the cave. There is no other reality for them. Now, one of the prisoners manages to break free of his shackles. And he stands up and he walks and he sees the walkway, and sees the cardboard cutouts, and walks out to the cave entrance and sees the real world. And he goes, shoot, this is what the real world is. My friends don't know. He goes running back down the cave, comes to his friends, the other prisoners, and says, hey guys, this reality you think is reality isn't. It's shadows on a cave. There's a reality here. These are illusions. This is a simulation. It's an illusion. They say to him, you're crazy. You're mad. You're insane. This is what happens to people. When the doors of perception, my second to last book was Opening the Doors of Perception. And in that book, I argue, when the doors of perception are opened, you see reality as it really is, infinite. I'm quoting William Blake there, by the way. It was the Blake poem, Songs of Innocence. And in 1954, a guy called Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which was his experiences with mescaline. And he said, you know, this is amazing. As soon as you take these substances, just suddenly you see the world as it really is. Yeah. Now, what we're planning to do is to recreate that whole event in Plato's cave. And we'll probably take the people on the walk to Eleusis the day before, because one of the people that's going to be involved in the group will be my Greek publisher, who's very keen. He knows a lot of people in Athens, so we could probably get the freedom to do this within the cave. And also there's a friend in the group that was involved in the Plato's Cave event, Lena, who is the girlfriend of the guy that does Ninth Wave, and she's Greek. So we think we could do something exceptional. And the plan is, I have a group of friends called oh dear, I've forgotten their names now. Sorry guys, I'll try and remember it if I can. And one of them is one of the guys that did the camera work for the David Attenborough stuff. You know, the guy with the drones. Wonderful. He's one of the guys that does the drone filming. Mm. And he interviewed me recently with a drone in a local forest here, which was really quite good and quite extensive. You can again look at that if you want. They're called the Dreaming Jaguars, by the way. The Dreaming Jaguars. Just look on their website and you'll see the film they did of me wandering around a local forest here talking about this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But the plan is they will come with us. And what we will do is we will have a drone which will be on the Parthenon. And it will take off from the Parthenon, the Acropolis, and it will fly out right over Athens, out of the bay, maybe to one of the nearby islands, fly back over Cape Sunion, and then fly along the coast, and then fly straight into the cave, where you've got me standing there with my purple robes, and I'll say, welcome to Plato's cave. It's going to be extraordinary. It's going to be absolutely extraordinary. And we've already got so many people who are interested in this and saying this is going to blow everything, because it's the idea of bringing forward ancient Greek myths, ancient Greek ideas, back to entheogens, dimethyltryptamine, all the areas I'm interested in. So it's going to be fantastic. Yeah, if it happens, that's going to be the problem because of COVID.
Yeah. Well, God willing. Let's talk about psychedelics. You've mentioned entheogens a couple of times there. Dimethyltryptamine. It's a big topic at the moment, isn't it? I know a lot of psychedelic research, particularly in countries like Canada and stuff. There's a lot going on at the moment.
A lot going on here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You know more than me. It's a fascinating subject. I've done ayahuasca 5-6 times. I've done mushrooms as well. I don't take them recreationally. I take them very, very seriously. I respect them deeply. But particularly ayahuasca, do you perceive ayahuasca to be something of, I've heard you mention before that you think it's maybe DNA speaking to itself. Do you still hold that view now?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I think the symbolism is quite precise. I mean, there was a guy called Jeremy Narby that wrote a book called The Cosmic Serpent, which I strongly advise reading if you've taken the opportunity. And if you read Jeremy Narby, he makes similar links to myself to the snakes and the idea of snake symbolism. Now, of course, if you look at snake symbolism and you look at the caduceus, people have snake symbolism in terms of when they have ayahuasca and virtually other things. It's DNA. It's DNA talking to us in one way or another. But it is more than that. Ayahuasca is very, very strange. It's very strange. Again, I think it was Michael Harmer, who was one of the original researchers into the subject. And he was told he tells the story of the original researchers that went down to the Amazon basin by the way, we can go on longer, and we're not restricted here, so I'm quite happy to continue. They went, when the original researchers went down to the Amazon basin, they were quite intrigued by ayahuasca. It's a brew, which is apparently filthy to taste and everything else as well, but it's made out of two plants, Banisteriopsis caapi and something called Psychiatra viridas. Now, the Banisterius caapi is a vine, and the Psychiatra viridas contains the DMT. And the local shamans mix this mixture together in certain ways, brew it all night, and then people drink it. Now, the question that the botanists were interested in was why they chose these two plants. Now, there are, I think I was told, 5,000 or 6,000 different species of plants in the Amazon basin. There's probably more. Why these two plants? Well, the shamans explained to the anthropologists, and they said that when they went shamanic traveling themselves, historically, plant entities would meet them at the other side, in the shamanic world.
Mm.
And the plant entities would take them into this virtual reality version of the Amazonian jungle. And they point at plants and say, you take one of those and you take one of that and you put them together. And then normal people can become shamans and can visit our world. Okay. The researchers were particularly intrigued by this for one very important reason. However many of the Psychiatra viridas leaves that contain the DMT you eat, you will never ever have an hallucination. You will never ever have a DMT experience. The reason being, when it gets into your stomach, the stomach excretes an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, MAO. And what that does is it lines the stomach to stop the DMT, the hallucinogenic aspects of the DMT that is contained in the plant, to cross into the bloodstream through the lining of the stomach. It stops it, so it doesn't go anywhere. So what you do is you have a stomach full of plants. Mm-hmm. However, Banisteriopsis caapi contains a substance, I think it's called harmaline. And harmaline, get this, is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So when you put the two together in a brew and you drink them, as it gets into your stomach, the MAO starts to generate itself and is immediately stopped working by the concepts of the Banisteriopsis caapi, which then allows the DMT constituents of Psychiatra viridas to cross the blood into the blood and then go up the spinal cord, cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain and bring about altered states of consciousness. How did the shamans know this? Or more importantly, what on hell on earth were the plants that told them to do that? Mm. You know, even modern chemists or pharmacists would struggle to be able to bring two plants together in that way when they've got the whole of the Amazonian jungle to pick plants, but they did. Extraordinary. And this tells you that there is some form of intelligence or entities involved in the whole DMT experience, which we now know. We know from Terence McKenna and the Machine Elves and everything else. But there's a group of my associates. There's been research done at Imperial College in London at the moment on DMT. I know some of the people who are researching it and are actually taking DMT under controlled conditions intravenously. And get this, one of my associates, who was involved in the guy that in the ninth wave, the guy that was involved in the Dracula caves, he told me, and he said the first time he took DMT under these closed conditions, he ended up in a place called the DMT zone. It's a kind of place you find, you shoot out your body and you're in this place. And he said, as I'm looking out, there's these entities and they're coming towards me and they're looking at me. And one of them comes over to him, looks him straight in the eyes and pokes him and said, "You should not be doing it this way. This is not how it should be done. I warn you, do not do it this way." He's back in the laboratory and he said, that was the most peculiar experience when the entities spoke to me. 2 weeks later, he takes DMT again. He's back in the DMT zone. A group of entities come over, including the same entity from last time. And it comes over to him and it says, "Look, I told you last time, this is not how you do it. Please don't do it this way." As he told me, he said, it was the same entity. Was I creating that in my subconscious? If I was, it was telling me to do something I wanted to do. So it was being counter to what I wanted to do. He said, I don't believe that for 1 minute. I believe that entity was waiting for me to tell me off again. So what does this say? And this is my book, my latest book, The Hidden Universe, because I now do the neurology, the neuropsychology, and the history of entities, and I call them egregores. Yeah. And I argue that there is this overlapping. So you can see now my overall hypothesis is suddenly becoming an uber hypothesis now. I'm spreading out into so many areas of experience. And this is why suddenly the academics are going, who's this guy, Anthony Peake? What is he? What? You know, there's one guy, a professor in upstate New York, who's just got into my work, and he's reading my books one by one. And he's not only doing that, he read the first book and he went back and reread it again and then listened to it on Audible, because my first book is on Audible with me reading it. And he keeps sending me notes and he keeps saying, oh my God, this is unbelievable. You know, and this is a professor of psychology over in America. And professor of anthropology, I should say. And this is the power of what I've been writing. And it's just because I cannot break through. For some reason, I cannot break through I've been on BBC Radio 5 Live once, and I've been on local radio a lot, but nobody is picking up what I'm saying. And I'm sure that this time round, I'm going to fail. You know, it's not going to break through, but there's so many other people now taking my ideas forward that I don't need to break through. It's going to break through soon. I may not be
That's
here.
your service being done, and then people will stand on the shoulders and take your work further. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's honourable. That's honourable. You know, these entities, for lack of a better term, when you take DMT, from experience, when I've been on ayahuasca, I tend to have if you ever read like E.T. books, I don't know how to explain them, very grasshopper-looking creatures, and they sort of dance around. And I have that quite often when I've been on ayahuasca.
Yeah, it is. It's the kind of the mantis.
That's it. That's the word I'm after.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by this because, again, the mantis theme seems to be fairly universal, and you can ring the mantis theme and you can move it into UFO lore, abduction, UFO abductions, and in the latest book I discuss UFO abductions. I discuss encounters with fairies, with the fae, going right through history. And I argue that what these entities can, whether there are different types of them, but I think there's almost this feedback mechanism going on. I genuinely believe, and this is the academic I was talking about who's reading my book at the moment, reading my work over and over again. We were discussing this and saying that there's this kind of overlapping between the entities and us. We kind of create them.
Yes, I was going to ask that.
And they become independent.
Is that our own psyche, or is it as I'm talking to you now?
Well, I would argue that, for instance, you and I now are creating an egregore. You and I now are creating something that's greater than both of us, because our energy, our organ energy, whatever we want to call it, our enthusiasm creates something that's independent of both of us. And when my groups meet, I usually, when we were free, I used to meet groups of 6 or 7 people. We used to talk for hours, and you could feel this something being created by us that was not us. Now, again, I'm also doing research on this at the moment, and we've got a research, myself and 2 other associates have got a research project which we're starting, where we're going to be trying to create an entity.
Wow.
And we're going to try and see if we can create an entity with one group and have another group in a different part of the country pick up that entity. Now, what we're doing here is we're working on something called the Philip experiment that took place, I think, in 1971 in Toronto. I don't know if you've heard of the Philip experiment.
No, I haven't. No.
Quite extraordinary. There was a group of researchers, including a professor of psychology who was English, together with his wife. And they used to be involved in ghost hunting and poltergeist activity. And the more they got into poltergeist, the more they started to say, do you know, this is not independent of human beings. This is people causing this. People are causing this in some way which we don't understand. And it's not fakery. There's something more going on. And they decided what they would do is to create a ghost and then see if it manifested on a Ouija board. And one of them went away and they created a story of a guy called Philip Aylesford. And they said Philip Aylesford was a Catholic nobleman who lived in Warwickshire in the time of just before or just after the English Civil War. And he was in this loveless marriage. And one day he falls in love with a local gypsy girl. His wife finds out and he's in danger of losing everything. And he commits suicide by jumping off the battlements of his stately home. That was the story. Yeah. Then they worked together to really create this person in their minds. And what they would do is they'd hold hands, they'd sing songs and everything else. And the reason they did this was it's known that if you get into almost like a childlike state, like people who have what's called quasi-corporal companions, a guy called Halliwell came up with this term, and I discuss it in my book on Egregores. What it is children seem to be able to create when you're in a childish mind state, you seem to draw in these creatures, you know, the monster under the bed, the mythical friend that children have. And I argue this is because their brains are functioning differently. It could be to do with the myelination of the neurons of the brain. It could be to the actual myelination of the corpus callosum, which means the two sides of the brain are not communicating quite in the same way. Yeah. But they see these creatures. Mm-hmm. Now, what is also fascinating is there are other group of people who see very similar creatures to the machine elves and everything else, including my own mother. My own mother saw a grey in her bedroom a few years ago. When people start to develop Alzheimer's, what happens is that the neurons again get destroyed by things called amyloid plaques in the brain. Mm-hmm. I think these explosions then open up the doors of perception. They break down the brain's ability to be an attenuator, that is, take out information from our perceptions, to open up the mind to this greater world that is leaking and is ready to come through at any opportunity. And this is what ayahuasca does. This is what DMT does. It allows the entities vibrational states whereby they can come through and they can manifest. So with the Philip experiment, they were like children. They found that if they started singing sea shanties and being silly, things would happen. Yeah. And they had tables coming up in the air. They had chairs flying around the room, and they manifested Philip. And we were really intrigued by this, myself and my two fellow researchers. So what we're going to do is see if we can recreate that experiment. We've been speaking to people who were involved in the original experiment. We've got now contact with 6 or 7 top parapsychologists in America who've been working on this. We are working with people who worked on something called the Hungry Ghosts, which is a fascinating case that took place again in Canada. And we believe that we've got something tangible here that we can take forward. At the moment, it's just getting the environment right and the controls right, because we're doing a proper formal experiment, which we will write an academic paper on. Yeah. And if we can prove this, we've then got something quite intriguing to take forward to the scientists, to the press, and to everybody to say, look, stop dismissing this, stop dismissing people's experiences. Just because it doesn't fit in with your science doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Yeah. Yeah. Your science has to change to accommodate the experience rather than just dismissing it, because that's scientism. That's not science. Yeah. It's like the bed of Procrustes, where they're trying to fit science into it's got to fit on that bed, otherwise we can't class it as science. And indeed, if anybody who has academic tenure, even for a moment, starts to show any interest in this kind of material, they are anathema, they are ostracized. And I'll give an example of just how terrible this can be. It's an actual fact. By a guy called Professor Brian Josephson. He's one of the few living Nobel Prize winners for physics in this country. Okay. He won it for something called the Josephson junctions, to do with quantum physics. About 10 years ago, a group of stamps were supposed to come out depicting living British Nobel Prize winners. Brian Josephson was supposed to be one of them. Do you know he wasn't allowed to be one of them? You know why? Because Brian Josephson is interested in telepathy. Oh. Isn't that absolutely outrageous? Could you possibly believe that in a modern civilization, a great scientist is denied that because he shows interest in things he's not allowed to show interest in? That is censorship. There's no other word for it. And it has to stop. If we are to understand the human condition and exactly what is happening, they need to be listening to myself and my fellow researchers and people like Brian Josephson. Stop ostracizing the scientists that can only get research to do this after they've retired. It's wrong. I completely agree. If you look at telepathy, it's hardly a new topic. This is thousands of years ago. This has been written about by the Tibetans and the Egyptians, and there's theories out there that telepathy actually was far before language. Yes.
So to consider telepathy as pseudoscience is nothing short of a disgrace.
Well, the thing that intrigues me is the way in which it is dismissed. And I'll give an example of how much this irritates me. If I can find the book, which I might have it here. It's just bear with me a second, okay, if you can. I'll see if I can find it up here. Cox, so it'll be CB, C, Plague. Cox. Okay, Professor Brian Cox. Mm-hmm. The guy that disses these things on television regularly, calls us all woo-woo idiots. Read the title of that book. Brian Cox. Jeff Forshaw, by the way, I did an event with Jeff Forshaw at the National Theatre in London a few years ago. I actually know Jeff. And when Jeff and I met, he turned around to me over a coffee at Manchester University, and he said, of course, we know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. Okay, this is the guy there that wrote the guy with Brian Cox. The title there is Everything That Can Happen Does Happen. This is exactly what I write about. In my work, I turn around and I say, as I said, in terms of there's all these outcomes and all of them that can happen will happen somewhere in the universe. I get dissed as being a new age wacko. Brian Cox writes about it and it becomes a bestseller. If you read this book, you'll find that Brian Cox talks about exactly the same things I talk about. Okay, but he doesn't draw any conclusions from it. But if you do draw the conclusions about non-locality, you're a woo-woo. But if you're Professor Brian Cox, you're not a woo-woo. Everybody thinks you're wonderful. Go figure.
I think that's happened throughout history, though, Tony, hasn't it? It's nothing new.
No, it's nothing new, and it is because if you don't have the gongs and don't have the qualifications, people think you can't do it. I'd argue that I'll guarantee there are few people, I'm getting vain here and I shouldn't do this, it's not really me, but I'm getting on my soapbox here. Brian Cox, I guarantee, knows bugger all about neurology. He probably knows nothing about magical tradition. He knows nothing about Gnosticism. He knows nothing about entheogens, but he knows everything. He's there to tell us that he's right. And the reason is, it's because their science is in total confusion. We have to believe that the Big Bang, the first billionth of a second of the Big Bang, the universe expanded by hundreds of times the speed of light. We don't know how, we don't know why that happened, but we have to do that because it's the only way we can make the theory of the Big Bang work. So in other words, we create theories based upon the observations that have no more basis in truth than anything else has. And these people do this all the time. And I guarantee that in 100 years' time, people will look back at this time of science and they'll say, we were like the medieval schoolmen who had their epicycles to explain why there was retrograde motion in the outer planets. It's because we are building a Heath Robinson science. A lot of quantum physics is literally just because we don't understand what we're seeing. So therefore we come up with these extraordinary ideas. We have virtual particles that apparently exist somewhere else, then appear here for a split second and disappear back somewhere else again. They don't know where that somewhere else is. 93% of the universe is missing. It's dark matter and dark energy. We call it dark matter and dark energy because we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
You know, but they stand there and they make these glib statements. It's like one of the things that I always use, and I love this one, is that somebody could turn around and say, you have idiopathic epilepsy. And you'll go, oh, wow, oh dear, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? It's a term that's used all the time by doctors. You know what idiopathic means?
No, go on.
Haven't got a clue. We don't know what it means. We don't know what the cause is. But we call it idiopathic. I call it the label theory of science. Give it a label, and if you make it Latin or Greek sounding, it gives you an authority. So therefore, you've solved it, haven't you? You know, it's the emperor's new clothes. It really is. It's the emperor's new clothes. And there's people like me pointing out and saying, hold on a minute. What about this? What about that? Why don't you link this to this? But now more people are going, you know, he might be right.
Yeah.
You know,
do you think science is moving in the right direction, or do you still think it's really wrapped up in dogma?
There used to be an old statement that said that science doesn't change by arguments or anything. It changes by the deaths of the people of the previous generation of scientists. There are a lot of young scientists coming up now who are fantastic, who are thinking totally differently. The people like Vlatko Vedrell, you know, read his book on the digitization of the universe, like people like Craig Hogan. There's a lot of guys out there now are really doing the business and are really then saying, come on, let's just look at the facts. Let's see what it really means. And it's great. And and more and more of them are contacting me now, which is wonderful. You know, it's really great. It's really an exciting period of time. The sad thing is that COVID is bringing it all to a sad halt, which is weird. And of course, then there is the $1 billion question: how come our daemons didn't know about COVID and warn us? You know, and I believe it's because the daemons know there's no escape from it. There's nowhere you can go. There's no escape.
I look at the way the world is at the moment, and I think it smells of the unconscious mind coming to the surface, and it's going, take a look at me, take a look at yourselves, and what can you learn from this?
I think you're right. I think there is a groundswell of people starting to think differently, and I think this has been a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call to our own vulnerabilities. It's a wake-up call to what we've been doing to the planet. You know, you could argue that COVID is literally the planet's reaction to this illness called humanity that's destroying it. You know, and it's desperate to get rid of us because we're just dangerous for it. You know, but it could be that, you know, it makes us realize we need to live more in tune with the world about us, and that's what I hope. I really genuinely hope, and that's what a lot of myself and my extended group feel. But at the same token, I always argue that, you know, keep an open mind, but don't keep an open mind so much that your brain falls out. And unfortunately, there's a lot of weird people out there that are coming to the most bizarre conclusions about what's going on.
The conspiracy theories are running riot at the moment.
It's people who really cannot accept the fact that we haven't got a clue what's going on. They have to believe that somebody's in control, that somebody is doing it in some way, because the idea that we don't know. You know, our leaders are they're like us. They have no idea what they're doing. They're knee-jerk
I look at the COVID thing, and I don't know your opinion on it, but I look at Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock up there, and we're not going to get political, but I go, you have absolutely no idea here.
No, they don't.
You have no idea what's going on. Can't we just say it?
Yeah, can't we just admit that we are terrified? It's like the thing that's been kept quiet at the moment, which will break soon, in my opinion, is that we will discover that the South African variation of COVID is immune to the vaccine, because nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about it, you know. And the other thing that intrigues me is the death rate in China. It's now getting to the point that the daily American death rate is going to be greater than the whole death rate in China since the beginning of the epidemic. What are the Chinese doing differently? What is it about that makes it different? And these questions that should be asked. But to me, you know, it's the conspiracy world at the moment is exasperating me. I'm getting to the point on Facebook now where I'm not having it anymore. I get people posting things on my wall that I'm just thinking, I just not having any more of this. It's Dunning. Do you know the concept of Dunning-Kruger?
You don't know what you're ignorant of. Basically.
Correct. It's Dunning-Kruger gone rampant. It's people who feel they don't have any respect for any experts on anything, but they have experts to the guy down the pub who's read a couple of websites. And what they do is they go into echo chambers then, whereby all they do on the web is they find things that reinforce their own nonsensical thinking. And if you try to criticize them, they get aggressive, and you think, oh, I couldn't be bothered. I just couldn't be bothered. But they do damage to people like you and I. They do damage to the people that are seriously trying to understand, because we get group with them. We get group with them, you know, as far as there's a fine line, there's the woo-woos, and then there's the rational people. We're on the bridge.
I call myself a rational consciousness researcher. That's more or less it, because as soon as you go into the woo-woo bit and everything else, it's like, you know, as soon as people bring crystals, as you say, and things like that, no, leave them at the door. We're talking rationality, we're talking science, we're talking spirituality, consciousness research and stuff. Anything beyond that, I sort of park, to be honest.
Yeah, so do I. And I feel that, you know, I have to. The problem is I'm becoming more and more of a public figure. So I have to be careful sometimes to what I say, but I'm getting to the point now where I just, you know, it's just going, there's a time and a place where you just say, I've just had enough of this.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not going along with it anymore. I'm not agreeing with your nonsense.
No. Tony, I think it's a good time to wrap it up. Is there anything, I know your last book was The Hidden Universe. Where can people get hold of that? Is it Amazon or?
You can get it in bookshops. You just go to your local bookshop. Well, I suppose bookshops aren't actually open anymore, are they? So yeah, I suppose it's on every platform of that you can buy online. So yeah, Amazon is as good as any. 3 of my books are now out in Audible with me reading them. The Hidden Universe will be out as I think it's The Hidden Universe. I think it's right. Will be out as an Audible book. Probably sometime this year. Unfortunately, it's not me reading it, which is a bit disappointing, but that was what my publisher decided. Also, they're on Kindle as well. Also, some of them are in Braille. So there's various ways. If you want to contact me, my website is anthonypeake.com. Also, as well, people might be very interested to know that every Monday afternoon at 3:00, I do a live broadcast on Facebook called APCH InCon, which is the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour in Conversation. And this is rather like what we've done now. It's an hour or 2 hours of me talking to somebody about their ideas and everything. It's a conversation over a beer or in front of a roaring log fire. And also then every month, every second Sunday of the month, I have Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, which will be a researcher or an academic or an experiencer. And we discuss their experience. And it will be this Sunday. I've got Dr. Gary Vasey, who is a fascinating expert on esoterica, who's based in the Czech Republic. And also on Monday, and you might be really interested in this, on Monday, my guest for InCon is a young lady called Rebecca Sharrock. And Rebecca Sharrock is one of only a handful of people around the world who, get this, has superior autobiographical memory. She remembers every single day, minute, dream of her life.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, that's what we're going to be discussing with her. But she's quite famous. And of course, she's living proof of my idea that, of course, we do remember everything. The brain knows everything that's going to happen in your life. It's just, it's sublimated.
Wow. And I think that's about it. You've mentioned your podcast, you've mentioned your books, your website. Yeah, that's it. Anthony, I've absolutely...
Oh, yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, also the YouTube channel. If you go on to, you find the Anthony Peake YouTube channel as well. All the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hours are up there. All the InCons are up there. And a lot of my videos and interviews and everything else as well, including the work I did with the Lucid Light device as well, is all on there. So check it out.
Social media pages?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Instagram as Itladino1, which is just the initials of my first book. Facebook as Anthony Peake. There's also Facebook pages for all of my books. I'm also on Twitter as well, but I'm not very active on Twitter these days. But it's very much Instagram and Facebook that seem to be my main areas of communication, but particularly Facebook. I post at least 2 or 3 times a day, and I'll be posting about this interview in about half an hour's time as well. So
thank you very much.
When it goes up, it'll obviously link it to all of them as well. Okay, thanks, Alex. This has been a fascinating chat.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, mate. Really.
It's all right.
Thank you.
Okay then.
Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.